When I walk through the front door of my home in Savannah, the air greets me like an old friend, warm, heavy with magnolia, carrying echoes of a life I carved with my own two hands. This house is more than wood and plaster. It is decades of night shifts at Memorial Hospital, evenings spent balancing bills by lamplight Sundays, when my late husband James and I painted shutters because hiring anyone else was unthinkable. James used to joke that every nail in the place held a story, and he wasn't wrong. The kitchen remembers our first Thanksgiving when the turkey burned, but we laughed anyway. The porch still carries the sound of cicadas on summer nights when we planned our son Matthew's future as he chased fireflies in the yard. Even after James passed, I kept the house not just for me, but for Matthew, so he would always know where his roots were planted. When Matthew married Elise last year, I hoped this house might become a gathering place again. He and his bride moved into a townhouse downtown, but they often visited. His smile was bright with possibility. His arm looped around her shoulders as though she was the center of his world. One afternoon, sipping coffee on the porch, Matthew asked if Elise's parents might come for dinner. "They're curious to see the place, Mama," he said gently. I hesitated. The Carters had been polite enough at the wedding, though Evelyn's sharp eyes judged every flower arrangement, and Leonard boasted about golf more than his daughter's vows. But in the South, hospitality isn't optional, it's a duty. So I agreed, assuring Matthew they were welcome, pride swelling at the man he'd become, even as unease flickered in me. What harm could one dinner bring? The Carters arrived the following Sunday. Elise carried a store-bought peach cobbler, smiling sweetly, while her parents stepped out of their sedan like they owned the gravel in my driveway. Leonard fiddled with his belt. Evelyn clutched a handbag stiff as cardboard. I welcomed them warmly, serving roast chicken seasoned with rosemary from my garden green beans, snapped fresh that morning, and mashed potatoes whipped smooth. Leonard ate heartily, then claimed my late husband's old recliner fiddling with the lever before declaring it lacked lower back support. Evelyn hovered in the kitchen, praising my china, but suggesting garlic powder over fresh cloves, as if convenience were the higher standard. I smiled politely while Matthew poured sweet tea and Elise filled silences with chatter pitched a little too high. When dessert was served still cold in the middle, I found myself alone at the sink while they laughed in the den. It wasn't unpleasant, not entirely, but something shifted. A boundary had been nudged. I told myself it was only one dinner yet when I glanced back. I saw Evelyn slip her shoes off on my rug as though she belonged. By the next Sunday, their car rolled over my gravel again, this time without knocking. Soon, their visits became routine. Evelyn perched at my counter, watching me chop vegetables, offering unsolicited advice about cookware and linens. Leonard sprawled in the recliner, commandeering the remote, the television so loud it drowned out thought. When I suggested lowering the volume, he tapped his ear, muttering about announcers. They carried themselves upstairs to the guest room, declaring my couch too stiff for Leonard's back. The yoga mat I once kept there was shoved into a closet. Harold's slippers lined the doorway. Evelyn called it just easier this way, as if convenience excused intrusion. I tried to hint at the discomfort, suggesting one weekend Matthew and Elise might want time alone. Matthew only shrugged his fork, scraping his plate. "It's temporary, Mama. Don't fuss." His tone echoed the boy who once brushed off my worries with a roll of his eyes. So I smiled thinly, though each weekend blurred into the next, their presence hollowing out the peace I once cherished. By the third month, I stood outside the guest room, staring at their slippers, and realized my house no longer felt like mine. One evening, I spoke to Matthew plainly in the kitchen. Maybe this weekend could be just us, no company. I'd like a little quiet. He laughed, shaking his head. "You're overthinking. They mean well." I reminded him they'd been here nearly every weekend since his wedding. He waved me off, unconcerned. The next day, I suggested inviting my sister Margaret down from Charleston. Matthew's face tightened. "You know how she is, always asking questions." He said he couldn't relax around her. I set down the folded linen slowly. So you can relax with the Carters every weekend, but not with your own kin for one night. He shifted, but didn't answer. Silence was answer enough. That evening, Leonard reclined with the remote. Evelyn hovered in the kitchen. Elise laughed beside my son as if nothing was amiss. I stirred a pot with steady hands, but my mind replayed every sacrifice the years James and I lived lean to build this house, every paycheck stretched for shutters, plumbing, paint. Every nail held a piece of me. And now strangers decided which detergent I should buy and how my water should run. Lying awake that night listening to their footsteps in the hall, I realized my silence had been mistaken for permission. The Saturday I pulled into my driveway and saw 2 oversized suitcases standing in my foyer, I knew the line had been crossed. Groceries still rattled in the back seat as I froze in the doorway. Evelyn appeared from the hall, beaming, as though she had brought flowers instead of luggage. "Hope you don't mind, Marjorie," she said breezily. "We thought we'd stay a few days. Leonard's back is acting up again, and it's easier not to drive back and forth." I stood with keys in my hand, silent. "Just until Wednesday," she added, already turning toward the kitchen. Matthew said it was fine. When I found my son, he leaned against the counter, scrolling on his phone. "It's no big deal, Mama," he said without looking up. "Just a couple of nights. You know how they are." I wanted to remind him whose name was on the deed, whose hands had paid every nail. But the words caught in my throat. Later upstairs, I saw the guest bed unmade, Evelyn's silk robe draped across the chair, where I once journaled, Leonard's slippers tucked by the door. The eucalyptus bundles I'd hung for calm now smelled faintly of menthol cream and aftershave. My symbolic sanctuary had been claimed. At dinner, Evelyn asked if I'd mind switching detergent because lavender made Leonard itch. Leonard added the upstairs shower pressure was rough on his shoulders. I promised to add it to my list, smiling as brittle as glass. Matthew chewed silently, eyes fixed on his plate. That night, I lay awake staring at the slow turn of the ceiling fan while their footsteps echoed down the hall. Every creak reminded me I was no longer alone in my own house. Memories crowded me, long shifts at Memorial Hospital, feet blistered from 16 hours of walking, the sacrifices James and I made to keep this house. Beans and rice so Matthew would never know want. Each improvement earned by sweat shutters bought one paycheck, plumbing the next. Every brick bore our names. And now my silence had allowed strangers to decide how strong the water should run. I reached for my phone in the dark, my hand trembling. Pride urged me to stay quiet, but pride had trapped me long enough. I typed a short message to my oldest friend Caroline, once a school principal, now retired outside town. "Do you still have that guest room?" Her reply came instantly. Always. Relief and fear tangled together, but beneath them was clarity. If I stayed silent, I would lose myself entirely. The next morning, I brewed coffee as though nothing had changed. Evelyn wandered in, wearing my robe, asking for chamomile tea that wasn't so flowery. I handed her what she wanted, smiling thinly. Inside, a new steadiness had settled. That evening, I told Matthew at the table, "Your cousin in Montgomery took a fall. She'll need help for a few days. I'll drive down tomorrow." He nodded absently, scrolling still. "Drive safe, Mama. No questions, no concern." He accepted my absence as easily as he had accepted the Carters' presence. Upstairs, I folded a few clothes into a small bag and placed a plain envelope on the dresser where I knew he'd find it. Inside, I had written in my careful hand, "If you need space now, you have it." The next morning, Caroline pulled into my driveway with her old sedan, her smile faint but encouraging. "Got everything she asked." I carried my bag out, closing the door without looking back. At Caroline's kitchen table, sunlight striped across the room, I told her everything. She listened quietly, nodding, then leaned forward. "If you're ready to act, I know a moving company that owes me a favor." There was no anger in my chest, only certainty. We began making calls. No dramatics, no confrontation, just a quiet plan unfolding step by step. A week later, I stood at Caroline's window as a white, moving truck rumbled down my street and stopped in front of my house. Two men in uniforms jumped out, clipboards in hand. Evelyn opened the door, her voice sharp with confusion. "Excuse me, what is this?" One mover held up the paperwork. "Delivery order for Carter residence. This address." Leonard sputtered, insisting it was a mistake, but the men carried in a mattress, a dresser boxes labeled in bold black letters, "Carter." Evelyn gasped as the guest room furniture shifted, her robe tossed carelessly onto a chair. Leonard's protests weakened with every load. By the time Matthew's car pulled into the driveway, the movers were already setting up a recliner in the living room. He froze, keys dangling, his face pale. "What the hell is going on?" he demanded. Evelyn turned toward him, frantic. "Tell them this isn't ours." But the mover handed him the manifest with their names written neatly across the top. His eyes darted from the paperwork to the stacks of boxes, to the empty space where eucalyptus once hung. Then he saw the envelope on the nightstand, tore it open, and read my line. Silence fell heavy and undeniable. Within days of the mover's visit, silence in the house gave way to tension. Matthew convinced himself he could manage without me, that my absence was only a small inconvenience. At first, he played the dutiful son and host greeting the Carters, with a smile ordering takeout when meals needed preparing and telling himself everything would balance out. But within weeks, the cracks showed. Leonard sprawled across the living room like it was his kingdom. Shoes littered the doorway, jackets draped across chairs, cups half full of soda abandoned on the coffee table. The recliner became his throne, the television, his pulpit, the volume so loud the neighbors must have heard every score. Evelyn, who once critiqued my cooking, refused to lift a hand in the kitchen. "I don't want to interfere with your system," she told Matthew, though I was no longer there. She left dishes piled in the sink, laundry stacked in corners. When Matthew asked for help, she smiled tightly and claimed she wasn't sure where anything belonged. Bills rose quickly. Grocery costs doubled, the water meter spun from showers and laundry, and the electricity stayed on all night with Leonard snoring in front of the glowing screen. At first, Matthew paid quietly, brushing off the expense as temporary. But as the weeks stretched into months, his patience thinned. That was when the messages began. Small at first. "Where do you keep the vacuum bags? How do you roast chicken again? The washer smells funny. What should I do?" I read them, then set the phone aside, choosing silence. The boy who once brushed off my concerns now reached for answers I refused to give. As time passed, his tone shifted. "They never clean up after themselves. I'm exhausted, Mama. I can't breathe in my own house." Each word carried the suffocation I had endured for months. He was learning slowly that my warnings had not been fussing, they had been truth. Meanwhile, I built something new. Caroline's home became a haven. At first, her guest room, soft with quilts, and her kitchen filled with the smell of fresh bread. Over cups of tea, we mapped the next step, reclaiming my independence. I found a small brick carriage house near the river. Modest but perfect. No echoes of old arguments, no shadows of anyone's demands but my own. Its bare rooms felt like freedom. I planted geraniums in terracotta pots by the windows and unpacked my life piece by piece. A chair by the window for reading. My journal back on a desk that was mine alone. In the evenings, I watched barges move down the river gulls, sweeping low, the water carrying me into a rhythm unclaimed by anyone. Caroline came often, sitting at my table while steam curled from our teacups. We spoke of books, of small joys, of days unburdened. The quiet wasn't lonely, it was restorative, like surfacing after being held underwater. Back at my old house, Matthew sank deeper. Neighbors spoke of clutter visible through windows, laundry spilling across furniture. Leonard left tools scattered in the yard. Evelyn scolded the mailman for bending envelopes. Matthew's texts grew longer, desperate. I can't do this, Mama. They criticize everything. I never have peace. Still, I held my silence. He needed to see for himself. He needed to learn that my home had not been built on convenience but on respect, and that without boundaries, even the strongest walls could collapse. One evening, Caroline showed me an online listing. My old house. Matthew had put it up for sale. The price was lower than its worth, the realtor's description polite, charming home minor repairs needed. But the photos told the truth. Rooms cluttered, a stained recliner where James once rested, dishes stacked high, curtains dulled by neglect. It wasn't the home I had built anymore. At first I braced for pain, but it never came. The house had been stripped of what made it sacred long before the listing. What remained was a shell. I closed the screen and set the phone aside, breathing easier. The house had been mine, but its value was never in plaster or wood. It was in the respect that once lived there, the sacrifices carved into its bones. That respect was gone, and I had chosen not to lose myself with it. That night, as I locked the door of my new carriage house key cool in my hand, I knew I had reclaimed something far more valuable than any property. I had reclaimed myself. The day the sale closed, I walked along the river path near my new home. The air was thick with salt and jasmine, the gulls swooping above the water, their cries sharp but freeing. Neighbors mentioned that Matthew had moved into a small apartment closer to downtown, a place too cramped for guests. The Carters, they said, had followed him like shadows. For months, they had lounged in the rooms I once cherished, but now their dominion had shrunk to a handful of square feet, and Matthew bore the weight of it all. I thought back to the day I left him that envelope. If you need space now, you have it. At the time, he had brushed off my concerns with a shrug, the same way he once ignored curfews or homework. Only now, adulthood pressed on him in ways he could not dodge. For every chore he neglected, for every bill he let them run up, for every silence he met with a laugh, he carried the consequence. I did not rejoice in his struggle, but I also did not rescue him from it. Some lessons I had learned cannot be handed gently. They must be lived. In my carriage house, I found solace in small rituals. Mornings with fresh coffee by the window, afternoons planting herbs in clay pots, evenings journaling in the soft light of a lamp. The quiet was not absence, but presence, a space I filled with my own choosing. Caroline visited often, her laugh echoing in my kitchen, reminding me that friendship is as much family as blood. When she left each evening, I locked the door with steady hands, a single key that belonged to no one else. The world whispered news of Matthew now and then. He struggled with Elise, whose patience thinned as the Carters pressed into every corner of their lives. Arguments flared over bills, over clutter, over the suffocating presence of parents who never knew when to leave. One neighbor told me she had seen Matthew sitting on the porch alone, his head in his hands, the television blaring inside, while Leonard shouted at the screen. I did not interfere. My silence was no longer permission, it was protection. Weeks turned into months, and I grew stronger. My garden bloomed with geraniums and rosemary, a promise that life always roots itself again if given soil and time. I hosted Caroline's book club once, laughter spilling through the carriage house, women marveling at how cozy it felt. One said, "It's peaceful here," and I smiled, because peace was what I had fought for more fiercely than any title deed. One evening Matthew called. His voice was quiet, stripped of the confidence he once carried. "Mama, he said I didn't understand. Not until now." He spoke haltingly of exhaustion, of how the Carters criticized everything, yet lifted nothing of how Elise threatened to leave if things didn't change. His words trembled with regret, but also with recognition. "I thought you were overreacting." I see now you weren't. I'm sorry. Tears pressed behind my eyes, but my voice stayed steady. I only ever wanted you to learn respect for yourself, for your home, for the people who built it before you. Silence followed heavy, but healing. For the first time, he listened without dismissing. We did not speak of reconciliation or moving back. We spoke, instead of boundaries, of choices, of how love must be paired with respect, or it collapses under its own weight. When I hung up, I sat by the window, watching the river reflect the last light of day. For the first time in a long while, I felt whole. The house I left behind was gone sold and stripped of meaning, but in its place, I had gained clarity. Walls and windows can be replaced. What matters is the space you protect within yourself, the space no one has the right to invade without permission. I thought of James, of his laughter in the old recliner, of how he once said every nail in the house held a story. He was right, but stories are not meant to bind us to a place. They are meant to teach us how to carry ourselves when walls shift and doors close. Now, as I lock my own door each night, one key resting in my palm, I know I belong not to a house, but to myself. And that lesson, hard as it was, is one I will carry until my last breath. If this story moved, you don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and comment below. Your support helps keep these stories alive for others who need them.